good afternoon and welcome to MedTech Crossroads. It's so good to be with you. This is our 66th episode, but this is a really special one. This week and next week in partnership with MedHealth, and I've got Stacy Frankovich here with me live. You can come on, Stacy, if you want. We have put together two shows having to do with COVID. And Stacy, I think this was kind of prescient in the sense that you were you mentioned this possibility to me. Oh goodness, it's been I think more than a month ago. And the discussion topics are very, very pertinent. What everyone happens to be talking about, this week and last week in the news. So I don't know how you did that, but it was great forward thinking on your part.
That crystal ball comes in handy every now and then, Gene.
It comes in handy sometimes. I appreciate that. And also just, this sort of informal getting together in the community and going, hey, here's two organizations that can bring people together. Let's go do something and let's have some fun with it and have a good discussion. So thank you for doing that. Just make sure everyone knows what MedHealth is and does.
Sure. Well, thank you, Gene. We're really excited to partner with you and your team, and MedTech Crossroads has become a staple in our lives. So really appreciate this opportunity. MedHealth is a cross-border collaboration. We're an organization that wants to connect, convene, and educate our MedTech startup community and our health tech community as a whole. So we really work to engage with the community to ensure that the technologies that are being developed here in Southeast Michigan and Southwest Ontario are getting the attention that they deserve. And we want to make sure that our technology community is educated on interesting facts and interesting updates. Obviously, COVID has really impacted everyone's life. So even from the MedTech startup area where we saw so many startups pivoting during COVID to try to help and do what was needed. But just that education piece where we really want people to understand that there's good information out there, sift through some of the noise. And that's why we're really excited to be here with you and bring in these experts and help us understand all there is to know about vaccines, variants, and boosters. So thank you for the partnership, Gene.
Yeah, well, thanks for being here, Stacy, and we appreciate it and appreciate your foresight to suggest this. So thanks for being with us. Well, with that, let's get right to it. I want to welcome Dr. Matthew Sims. He's the Director of Infectious Diseases Research at Beaumont Hospital since 2006, and Dr. Dennis Cunningham, Medical Director of Infection Prevention at the Henry Ford Health System. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you for having me.
And let's see, do we have Dr. Cunningham there?
Hello, how are you?
There he is.
I am here.
Wonderful. Excellent. Thanks for being with us. Well, gentlemen, you have, we appreciate you taking the time to do this, and you guys are at hospital systems that have, let's just say, had a front row seat for COVID over the past year and a half, not always in the happiest ways. Southeast Michigan was one of the original hotbeds, so we thank you for what you guys have done to, try to figure this out as the year and a half has passed. But I wanted to basically start with a little bit of a retrospective to have you share whatever you'd like of the history of this disease from your, Southeast Michigan perspective of having sat inside these healthcare systems. What are some of the highlights? One of the things that, especially early on, we have talked a lot about is how healthcare workers adapted to the disease and really learned how to respond to it. But whatever highlights or challenges along the way that you think summarize the history in each of your healthcare systems, I'd love to just have a quick retrospective.
I'll be happy to start. It was, it's been a journey. It's along the way. One of the things I said kind of early on is it really felt like we were at war, shoulder to shoulder, marching off to war. Once we started hearing about this virus out there and it back in January of last year, it became obvious that this was going to be the next SARS or worse. And clearly, it was much worse. And so we started discussing issues and we started, appearing before the media to talk about it and talking about masking and what we knew at that point, which, turned out to be so little comparatively. But I was on service at Royal Oak the week, not the week we got our very first case, but the next week, because we got our very first case on like a Thursday, and then we got a couple more, before the next week started. But by the end of the week I was on, we had hundreds of cases admitted. And, I just remember, we had limited personal protective equipment, limited, especially N95s. It very much was, what are we going to do? Again, the people were coming in and they were sick, but they weren't usually that sick right away. And then they would progress, they'd get intubated. We've learned since that, we shouldn't have intubated so fast, but there was no way to know. They had ARDS. Steroids doesn't usually work in ARDS. So nobody was using steroids in the beginning. We've learned since that steroids help. And, there was this drug out there, remdesivir, that was being studied, and you might be able to get it for compassionate use. But for most of the people we were trying to get it for, by the time it got there, they were already not eligible for it because it took time to get approval and shipment. And that first week was, I've never, seen anything like it. We didn't have anything to do for these patients. And it was, I watched 30-year-olds who, with young kids and who nobody could come to the hospital to see them because of the restrictions. And I watched them die and having almost nothing we can do for them at that point. It was just, tragic. Tragedy piled on tragedy. And then, the next is really interesting because, at least in my group, we all settled into, one person was running infection control, I was running research, one was organizing the whole Department of Medicine. Everybody had specific roles, and I started getting studies in and getting approval designed, and I've never been so active and so crazy. I designed a 22,000 patient study that we had up and running in 3 weeks, and I wouldn't have thought that was possible outside of this. And in less than a month, and again, wouldn't have thought it was possible outside of something like this. So
It's
it was
amazing
definitely
how fast many things moved during that time period. That was certainly a
yeah.
hallmark of quick responses. I want to move on and give Dr. Cunningham a
Yeah,
chance to
no,
answer this question because
absolutely.
we want to get to the vaccines, boosters, and variants here. But Dr. Cunningham, what are your brief recollections of this past year and a half, and highlights and lowlights?
Sure. So I've been with Henry Ford since November. Before that, I was with McLaren in the same role. I was also a hospital chief medical officer. So I also had the perspective of behind the scenes operations. And I have to say, some of the wonderful things were the amount of collaboration between all the systems, the chief medical officers of systems, the infection prevention people, the healthcare workers. It is amazing what they've done. I'm really proud to be part of that. We also learned some lessons that we were way too dependent on foreign supply chains. We used to get 80% of our personal protective equipment from Taiwan, China, and India, and all of a sudden we couldn't get it. People were resourceful, reaching out to auto companies that weren't working for them to make plastic gowns, since a lot of the supply companies just weren't able to make stuff for cars. So that was really good. And it really was the trial and error. It was so unfortunate if people were the first one to get sick, because Dr. Sims is right. We were not sure how to treat this, and we've gotten a lot better, but it takes experience, trial and error. And this was truly one of these once in 100-year events. And I hope to God I never see an outbreak like this again, but it really stressed all of us.
Yeah, well, thanks for that recollection. I think it's once more worth repeating. We've said it many times. We're very thankful to the number of healthcare workers who did go through that process of collaborating and working and trying. Even the FDA was, especially in those early days, they were actually working weekends, which is kind of new for the FDA, but it was encouraging, very encouraging to see. Well, I want to take you to the topic at hand today of vaccines, boosters, and variants. And let's start with the vaccines. I want to go a little bit into how the vaccines work at a base level, because I don't think a lot of us have sort of remembered this or talked about this, but I think it helps to explain how it interacts with the virus. which helps us to understand why they're working against variants in general, which I think is one of the things that we'll be talking about today. And just for the sake of everyone's visualization, because I'm a visual person, I'm going to bring a quick graphic up here for us to speak to that of the SARS-CoV-2 virus with its spike protein there. I think we've heard, and looking to you guys for sort of either confirmation or clarification. CDC, if you go to their webpage, are saying, look, this is very much a T cell and B cell kind of thing where your body remembers what it's seen before, whether it's the virus or in this case with the vaccine. It's this spike protein on the surface that everyone is focused on, because that's what I think sounds like very appropriately vaccine developers targeted. And they said, out of the 30,000 base pairs in the genome for this thing, and any combination of which could be interesting to your body to respond to in building immunity, we got these 3,831 base pairs on this spike protein. We're going to target those. Your body's going to remember some subset of those when it sees it again. You see it in the vaccine, then you see it again, and your body goes, wait, I know this. Is it a correct statement, though, to say we're not remembering the entire spike protein? We're remembering some subset of base pairs when we see it after we've been vaccinated? Is that roughly how this is responding?
Yes, what these vaccines are doing is they're going into our cells. Our cells then produce the spike protein, and our immune system can react to a portion of that spike protein. We call it a spike protein because it's spiking out of the surface, but it's really how the virus enters human cells. So if you can get antibodies or protective proteins to hit that spike protein, you can stop it from invading and causing disease.
Yeah, and I'll just add that, when the body sees the spike protein, when the cells that what we call the antigen presenting cells put that out there to create antibody, they put out little pieces of it. They chop it up and they put out little pieces of it. And not all the antibodies made to every piece really knock out, right? So as Dr. Cunningham mentioned, the spike is what lets the virus enter our cells. Of the spike, it's called the receptor binding protein, and even a smaller portion in there called the receptor the receptor binding peptides, which are the ones that really are contacting. And it's really the antibodies against that receptor binding domain that really neutralize the virus. Others have some neutralization, but 90 is from the antibodies to the receptor binding domain. And so that's what's key. And with these variants, it's mutations in that receptor binding domain that make it less likely for the current vaccines to potentially recognize, or the current monoclonal antibodies to necessarily recognize new variants of the virus. That's what we're afraid of, is that those areas of the virus will change so much that useless.
Specifically with respect to the spike protein.
Right.
Because, and that again is what the vaccines are targeting, if we understand correctly.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay, got it. So I just want to put that graphic up there for folks so people could sort of see what we're talking about. It helps me to visualize it. What are we seeing in terms, before we go to the variants and stuff, let's talk about efficacy overall from the vaccines. What are we seeing in terms of overall efficacy from the vaccines? Let's sort of go pre-Delta, because that's all the news right now, and we'll talk about that in a second. But if we look over the last year, what are we seeing?
Sure. Well, they're actually extremely effective. The first two vaccines, Moderna and Pfizer, you're talking roughly 95% efficacy. That's far better than the flu. Some years that's 2 or 3 times as good as the flu vaccine. So very, very strong vaccines. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine, you're talking maybe mid-80s for protection. But when you look against severe disease, death, hospitalization, all 3 vaccines are extremely effective and helpful.
Because they're all training your body to look for this stuff. Dr. Sims, your thoughts there in terms of efficacy?
Yeah, it's exactly right. The J&J, depending on where the study was run, it came out, 70s to 80s. whereas the Moderna and Pfizer are both 95% effective against the wild type virus, the original virus that they used in the design of this vaccine. But as Dr. Cunningham said, it's really, even more importantly, against severe disease. If you do have a breakthrough case, it protects you from needing to go to the hospital. This is really how the flu vaccine works. Dr. Cunningham mentioned the flu vaccine. The flu vaccine only really gives you, depending on the year, between 30 and at best 90%. And those are really rare years you get that high. Protection against getting infected. But what it does is it gives you really high protection against getting very sick. And, it saves people's lives. I mean, thousands and thousands and thousands of lives saved by the flu vaccine every year. The COVID vaccine is similar, except it actually protects against the infection itself even better. In fact, the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines actually give better antibody response than the natural infection does, which is almost unheard of in vaccines.
What would the reason for that be?
It has something to do, we don't have the exact answer to that, but it has something to do with how it works. This mRNA vaccine platform where your own cells create the mRNA and then the body responds to it. Something about that is making people respond better, because all of the vaccine types, there's, and most of them not in the US, but there's mRNA, there's adenovirus, which is J&J or AstraZeneca, there's protein-based, there's weakened virus, there's all these, they all present the spike. They all work the same basic way. But for whatever reason, the mRNA ones get a much higher response. I can't explain it. It's just, we clearly see it.
That's interesting. I'm
And
sure
I
some of
think
our
you're
audience
gonna
would be interested in the follow-up on that research. That'd be a great thing to follow up on. Dr. Cunningham.
I think you're going to see more and more vaccines that will start to be made with this new mRNA process because it is so effective. And I also want to make sure people realize, well, this was the first mRNA vaccine that was used widespread in this country. People have used mRNA vaccines for over 10 years. If you ever read in the news about immunotherapy for cancer, it's an mRNA vaccine that helps your white blood cells fight cancer better. So the technology is not that new, and there's a lot of experience under the belt. It's very promising for even more advances and wonderful results.
Yeah, that's a great point. And the other real advantage of the mRNA vaccine, specifically as they developed it for COVID, but even they've used it to try to make Ebola virus, they never have to work with the actual infectious use these vaccines. So these vaccines have zero chance of giving you the disease. There's zero chance of an accident causing a, like that.
This is
And it exists.
Thanks for sharing that. So it's interesting, and we may follow up afterwards on some of the data of that. But that's neat. I want to remind our audience also that Q&A is always a possibility. Feel free to use the Q&A button if you want to ask a question. We'll slot that in at the appropriate time. And depending on how many questions there are, we may slide past the 3 o'clock hour. We understand many of our listeners have to drop off at 3, but if there's more to go, we'll talk about it. I want to go next to the question of variants. And obviously the one that everyone's talking about right now is Delta, although I think in a little pre-chat, Dr. Sims, you were mentioning Lambda as well. Help us understand right now, let's talk the US, for example. How are those variants faring against the vaccine?
Yeah, so Delta is the major variant. The latest estimates from the CDC is it's over 50% of all of the circulating virus. And that in the areas where there's a lot of virus circulating, Missouri, Colorado, a number of different parts of California now, it's the majority by far, 70, 80% is Delta. The thing about Delta is really everybody got used to was what they call the UK variant, which is now called Alpha. And that took over everything in the US. The wild type went away and it became almost all Alpha, right? The same thing was seen. And now Delta is taking over that. So the question becomes why. So with Alpha, Alpha was about 50% more contagious than the wild. Delta is about 50% more contagious than Alpha. So it spreads more efficiently. Therefore, it spreads faster, et cetera. For the other problem with the Delta is that against the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine, it seems to only be about 64% effective at preventing disease as compared to 95% effective against wild type. It's still 95% effective at preventing serious disease, but we get more breakthroughs, and that's the issue with Delta.
So can repeat those numbers because our audience will be interested in hearing that. So breakthroughs with Delta with the vaccines, and again, to say that there are breakthroughs is not absolutely like, oh my goodness, it's always going to be a percentage. It's always a percentages game. But what are the percentages that we're dealing with here for breakthroughs for Delta?
Against wild type and Alpha, Pfizer, for example, because that's where we have most of the data because it came out of Israel where they used a lot of Pfizer. Pfizer was 95% effective against wild type, 95% effective against Alpha at preventing any disease. It's only 64% effective against Delta. However, it's still 95% effective at preventing severe disease.
Okay. So, and this may be an oversimplification, correct me if I'm wrong, but we're sort of saying here that there's a probably 30% chance, 30 to 40% chance that even if you're vaccinated, you will get the disease, but still a 95% chance that it's not going to do anything bad to you.
Right. So, and it's the 30% chance that if you have a significant exposure to the disease where you could be infected, that you would not be protected.
Gotcha.
Roughly.
Okay. Dr. Cunningham, anything to add to that? Oops,
I think we lost Dr. Cunningham, but it looks like he just popped back on.
Okay. Oh,
there he is.
Activity issues. It's a great day. There's some storms rolling through the area. So, Dr. Cunningham, we were just talking about the response of Delta to the vaccines. We heard a 64% keeps you from getting it as opposed to the original 95%, but still 95% chance that you're not going to get dramatically ill from it. Any additional thoughts on the responsiveness to the vaccines of the variants?
Agree completely with that information. What I would stress, though, that these variants are arising in unvaccinated people. So if we want to prevent future variants, we really need to get more people vaccinated. Dr. Sims already alluded to the possibility we could get a variant that is completely resistant to the vaccines. And I think that's an important public health message about why everyone needs to get vaccinated if at all possible. It's the only way we're going to end this cycle of all these different variants coming in, causing lots of cases. And unfortunately, there are mortalities with it.
Yeah. And just as you reminded us that, I'm worried about when's the variant that doesn't work at all. That's probably a stepwise thing. So take 10 or 12 mutations in the wrong spots to lead to that, right? But if you get Delta and Delta's got one or two of those mutations and then takes over, well, then the next variant emerges out of Delta. So it already has those mutations. And now it gets maybe two more mutations that make it even a little worse. And then the next one arises out of that. The problem is that you get sequential changes, and each series of changes makes it worse. Alpha was bad because it spread faster and maybe made people a little sicker and maybe affected kids a little more. Well, now Delta is even faster than Alpha, and it doesn't work as well with the vaccines and with the monoclonal antibodies. Each step makes the next variant that much worse.
I remember reading that Delta is associated with a faster onset and a higher viral load or something like that. So it's in that sense, it's also moving faster, like you said.
Yep.
So help us as we think about these variants. CDC has taken this step, and from a public health perspective, it makes perfect sense. I think we didn't talk about safety of the vaccine, but I think it's, people get lots of sound bites of, oh, this thing happened. Well, yeah, in a small number of people, something can happen, but overall it's very safe.
All of them are very safe. Even J&J, which was the one that had the blood clots associated, and now a small number of Guillain-Barré cases, it's still unbelievably safe as a vaccine.
From a population health perspective,
From a-
we're
from
working
a
against something much
population
bigger
perspective,
than those
exactly.
small numbers. Yeah, understood.
Exactly.
So CDC took the step of talking about strictly unvaccinated individuals, but has not divided a line. And from a population health perspective, this makes total sense because it's like the vaccine's safe. It should, the more we can get, the more we can slow this down. But there's not a lot of science being talked about natural immunity. We talked about base pairs, right? So
Sure.
natural immunity, if I've had the infection, we're not talking about a passing, I think I might have had COVID a year ago. No, like we're talking about a robust infection that creates an obvious immune response. So we could forget about the other parts of it. I've got 30,000 base pairs that my body could be responding to with that immune response. It seems like there's a lot of keys to a lot of locks, a lot of memory there. We don't hear a lot of talk about natural immunity versus vaccine. Again, I think we understand from a public health perspective, we've got a safe, effective vaccine. We need people with T and B cell memory in their bodies, or otherwise we've got factories for new viruses. So with all that being said, if we look into natural immunity, I know there's a much gone back and forth Cleveland Clinic preprint study that's come out where they looked at 50,000 their 50,000 employees. And this was earlier, but of the 1,000 who got COVID but never got a vaccine, a year plus later, none of them had gotten a reinfection. But what are your thoughts on natural immunity? What do we know about it? What do we not know about it? Obviously, everything has the potential to wane, natural immunity and vaccine. We just don't know. But talk to us about natural immunity. None of this is to say, if you think you had COVID a year ago, don't worry, you're fine. None of this is to say that.
Just very briefly, and then I'll pass it over to Dr. Cunningham. As I mentioned earlier, the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines seem to give a higher level immunity than natural immunity, which is impressive because that is essentially unheard of in vaccines. The J&J, the AstraZeneca, some of the others don't necessarily seem to do that. This seems to really be about those mRNA vaccines and how well they generate immunity. That being said, natural immunity is good. One thing we have that has been shown is if you have natural immunity and you get a vaccine, any of the vaccines on top of that, you get a much better response. It's a boost. So it's been recommended from the beginning that anybody who had COVID still get vaccinated. In the beginning, we told people to wait 90 days because we knew that 90 days was clearly protective. And we had short on vaccines. Now that we're not short on vaccines, we don't say wait 90 days. We say wait till you're out of isolation and your symptoms have resolved and then just get vaccinated. And there's all sorts of things they're looking at with mixing vaccines now. I don't want to get into all of that complicated issue, but there are definitely ways to make the immune response even better. And we'll see where that goes from here.
From a population
I'll
health
add that if
perspective, the more you can do. Yeah, Dr. Cunningham, please. Yep.
Brazil had a really bad outbreak of COVID, and then they had the P1 variant come back. I think that was March or so, somewhere around there. And they wound up, lots of people who had natural immunity were coming down with COVID again. So the natural immunity is good for that specific type of virus. But as we get the different variants, the natural immunity is probably not quite as good. And I so agree with Dr. Sims. If you've had COVID in the past, still get the vaccine. They are going to boost your immune response. It's going to help you have better protection against the variants.
Actually, if I have a slide I can show you that if you'd like. That
yeah, let's do it.
Really,
yeah, I think we tested that earlier, so you can go ahead.
Yeah,
and share.
we did. Hold on, let me share my screen. This is actually a pretty good slide for this. Here it is. Okay, I'm not going to put it in the display mode because I don't think we really necessarily need to. I have a whole bunch of slides that I've used over the. And this is just one. This is actually a brand new slide. Looking at convalescent serum, which is equivalent to natural immunity, right? Convalescent people make after they've been exposed. And this is the Moderna vaccine, and this is the Pfizer vaccine. And what this is against wild type. On the left is always wild type, and the right is always the C is overall the amount of neutralization. That's what this is measuring. How much virus can be neutralized is lower in convalescent serum than it is in people who are vaccinated, right? You see how much higher these start out. And that the drop to Delta in convalescent serum than it is in the vaccines. And in convalescent serum, you see some people dropping under where it would be considered effective, right? And you don't see anybody dropping that low, vaccinated groups. So overall, natural immunity is not quite as good, again, especially against Delta, than at least the Moderna and the Pfizer. And this has been shown, this was shown with wild type way back, that it had a higher immune response than natural infection. And I'll stop sharing the screen now.
So what's interesting about that, thank you for that, Dr. Sims. What's interesting about that is you've said that the vaccine, it's unusual to think that it could do that. It's not normal for vaccines. You said it has something to do with the mRNA nature of the vaccine. What kind of, it's sometimes it's nice in science to have a hypothesis as to why something might be, to be able to say, okay, this is what we're working with here. What are we missing that would scientifically make it plausible that the vaccine, I mean, I'm not, and we can all go look at the research and it's fun, but what scientifically could we be looking at under the hood there?
It's probably how it's presenting the protein, right? How and how much, right? If it just presents much more of the protein, then that would explain it. You just get a more robust reaction because you present a lot as compared to a natural infection. It could have something to do with the way it presents it, because this mRNA is being made, this spike is being made by our own cells, not by, it's not just getting it off the virus. It's being made by our own cells. It's not really clear to me. I don't know, Dr. Cunningham, if you've seen any, data or articles explaining why it may be.
No, I haven't seen anything that really explains it very nicely. I think the way I look at it, we are getting a lot more of this spike protein produced, and instead of 1 or 2 or 3 of these antigen presenting cells reacting, it might be hundreds or thousands or millions. And I think that's probably why we're getting this more robust immune response. Quite honestly, I don't care how it's happening. I'm just grateful it's happening, and these vaccines are so good.
These are some of the best vaccines we've ever had. They really are.
And what we're doing here is we're manufacturing the spike protein in the body instead of inside of an egg or whatever else we would have done it inside of a factory.
Yes.
Correct.
In short. Let's, before we come back to the line of questions that we have here, we have a couple questions from the audience here. I'm going to interject at this point. One from Ken, are mRNA vaccines safer for people with issues like bone marrow transplants, I suppose, than traditional vaccines?
Absolutely. This is not, there are a number of different kinds of vaccines that are safe in that population, but these are not live vaccines. They have no virus. Even the adenovirus vaccines aren't even really live vaccine either, but you have an intact virus there, or you can get sort of unusual immune responses like the Guillain-Barré. In this, there's no virus. There's no viral shell. It's an mRNA encased in some lipids. So you're not going to have an immune reaction to the virus, an infection. There's absolutely no chance that this can cause an infectious issue in a person with a suppressed immune system.
That makes sense. We have another question. So Dr. Cunningham, anything to add to that?
Oh, no, he's absolutely right.
Okay, let's go. There was another one here. I just misplaced it. Here it is. What has your experience been as it pertains to pharmacovigilance with the vaccines available? Are you seeing differences between vaccines in our local populations? Interesting question. Or is our
I've been
data
tracking
just...
vaccine reactions for all the...
Sorry, go ahead. We just lost
I've
you
been
for a second
tracking
there.
that for the... Oh, sorry about that. I've been tracking the COVID reactions for our employees, and It's been very well tolerated. It doesn't matter which vaccine employees get. They're all responding so well to it. I can tell you that shortly after we really had a number of people vaccinated, I was comparing what is the risk of COVID infection in our vaccinated and unvaccinated employees. And depending on the day, it was 24 to 27 times higher risk of getting COVID if you weren't vaccinated. So in terms of the different populations, I'm seeing people respond well to all three vaccines, regardless of what medical problems they have, what their ages, their race, their gender. It doesn't seem to matter. They're just darn good vaccines.
They're working.
They are. The only thing I would add to that is the one group that really does seem to have a problem, not with side effects, not or anything like that, is people who have had COVID before may have a little bit higher side effect, but it's not universal. I've seen people without a history of COVID get rough side of not bad, but a day of feeling lousy. Whereas people who had COVID, I've seen them get none, and I've seen some people with COVID get that really feeling lousy. But the one, unfortunately, the vaccine does fail us is in the immunosuppressed population. And some of them, it depends on what's causing the immunosuppression, but transplant patients, especially people who are on the drug called Cellcept, which is one of the immunosuppressives used in transplant, they just do not respond well to this vaccine, to any of them. And it's unfortunate because, no matter, they're still, and there's people looking into giving booster shots and things like that. And there's some data that says in at least some of the people, it may get better, but they're the only group that has any kind of medical condition where the vaccines just don't work.
And it's so important, if you have a family member who's immunosuppressed, it's even that much more important that you get vaccinated so that you are that barrier, so that you don't bring the virus home to your loved ones who have immune problems.
Absolutely. Great. Well said.
Great. And thanks to our listeners for the questions. One more question on natural immunity, and then we're going to go to the topic of children, which is something that often doesn't get talked about, and it's really important to a lot of parents. But on the natural immunity question, really quick, I think what you showed, Dr. Sims, on the serum levels, were those bench studies or were those in vivo?
Those are bench studies there, but they're taken from people, right? So that's convalescent serum that was taken from a person. Those are antibodies that were generated by people who got the vaccine, right? So that's measuring the neutralizing ability of a person's antibodies, whether they were generated by a vaccine or whether they were generated against the virus. That is not the same as saying how well does it work in in real life at preventing it in that person. It's a surrogate measurement.
Gotcha. Dr. Cunningham, you referenced something out of Brazil where there were breakthrough infections. Is there anything that we can say about actual boots on the ground data of breakthroughs for naturally immune or prior infections? Is there substantial research on the variant breakthroughs?
So one of the challenges, how do we tell someone had COVID in the past? A lot of the tests were looking at antibodies, protective proteins, or B cells, a type of white blood cell make. They are not the greatest tests. Which particular antibodies they measure varies from brand to brand. There's over 50 some different types of protective antibodies. Do these antibody tests measure the right ones that neutralize or destroy the virus? So I think that's been one of the challenge that people have seen. Again, it does not look like there's much breakthrough disease in people with natural immunity, certainly within 90 days of recovering from the infection and probably within a year. The other piece that makes it a little tough is to know when people are infected, what variant did they have? Right now, public health departments will analyze a small portion of the viruses and tell us what variant it is. The tests are not approved for clinical treatment use. So as the physician, I'm not told my patient, Mrs. Smith, had the Delta variant or had the UK variant. I think that's made a little bit previously vaccinated. There's been some good studies, but again, there's small numbers, and I wish we had more data on that.
So there's sort of two important sides to what you just said, and I'll say them back, and you tell me if I got them right. One is, if you're presented with the hypothetical patient who had a truly robust infection, you're saying, yeah, they're probably good for at least 90 days to a year, but I challenge you to prove to me that that person truly had a robust infection. How are you going to prove it?
Yeah,
Is that
exactly.
a
Because
fair?
these antibodies in the blood, it is. The antibodies really peak about 6 weeks after infection. By 3 months, they're starting to drop, and over time, they may not be detected. You might still have had infection. You still are likely protected. It's just the blood tests are not great for that particular research question.
Yeah, no, that's great. I want to move. Thank you for those answers. Very good, very clear. I appreciate the interaction over that. Let's go to the question of children, because this matters to a lot of parents. And of course, we're blissfully in the summer right now. It's not so much of an issue, but of course, the question will come up again. What are we doing in the fall, as it did last year? And the vaccine's not available to young children. It's also the case that
Down to
mortality
age 12.
down to age 12, thank you, yep. Mortality in that age range is not high, but then the whole question of complications and everything else is a whole big can of worms. So the question is this: assuming that parents are fully vaccinated, what are the risks to kids, and what precautions should parents of children be taking? Because this is a group that we can't under 12 vaccinate, and we're presuming they haven't had a
Well,
robust case.
there are ongoing studies right now looking at the vaccine in younger children down to even 6 months of age. And I'm hopeful by end of summer, early fall, we'll have that data available. In terms of the risk question, going back to school, keeping kids out of school has been detrimental. There's loss of learning, but even more important than that, many children have had social isolation. It's worsened depression, anxiety, eating disorders. So I'm firmly in the camp, if we can at all send kids to school, I'm all for it. Again, if we as parents and older children are vaccinated, there's an element of safety there. We may need to wear masks this fall. I don't know yet. It's really going to depend if we have more surges, what happens with the numbers in the state, but that might be one possibility. As soon as the vaccines are approved for use in younger children, I think it would be great if people get them. But I can tell you, for that 12 to and over group, my teenagers both got the vaccine, and I had a big sense of relief when I immunized them.
Yeah, I'll add, I have an 11-year-old and a 13-year-old. So I have one who's just in the range to be able to get the vaccine and one who's just out of the range. The 13-year-old was one of the first ones at Beaumont immunized, because I had been getting, as soon as it's available, I'm going to vaccinate my daughter. My daughter wanted it. I didn't have to tell her. She knew she wanted it. And she was on the front cover of all the newspapers, and she got interviewed by all the news stations because she jumped ahead. And I was so proud of her, because she basically told her age group, go and get this little shot, and that's it. It's over, and you're protected. And she went out and told people, do this. And she did that, and she said, don't listen to somebody's random opinion on Facebook. Talk to your doctor. So important. Now my youngest daughter can't get it yet, and we're desperate to get it for her. She wants it. She was actually upset that she couldn't get it. And now we have to make the decision of what to do come fall and school. And I agree. My kids have fortunately done well in school, remote learning, but I know lots of kids haven't, and I've seen the social impact that Dr. Cunningham talked about, that they're separated from their friends. They don't get the chance to develop those social skills that they need. Heck, older kids, think about the impact on kids who are dating and whatnot. And there's a whole section of their losing. And we need to get that back for them. That being said, if my daughter is not vaccinated, potentially even if she is vaccinated, she's going to be wearing a mask, whether the school's mandated or not. She's going to be wearing a mask, and I think it's until the majority of kids are vaccinated, it's still important to use those masks, because it curtails the spread. There was I recently did an interview where they asked me about that, and they had somebody else who said, well, there's only been 1% spread in schools. And I said, yeah, 1% total spread in schools. But when you have an outbreak in a school, it's a lot more than 1%, A. And B, all that data was gathered when the mask mandate was in place, right? So to say there's 1%, but a school may not have any. And so that zero gets averaged in to the school where 30 kids got it or 40 kids got it. So it's misleading to say things like that. And again, those measurements were done when everybody was wearing masks. So, it's not the same thing as, well, we can just send them back without masks and they'll be fine. So I think that it's really important to get the kids to school. There are incredible benefits to getting them to school in terms of learning, social development, food. Some kids, this is how they make sure they get a meal or two every day, especially in the certain parts of Detroit and other areas. This is about making sure of so many things that they need. But we need to do it safely, and that may mean continue masks.
And we'll get to the mask question here in just a second. It's a nice segue to that. But before we go there, a question from one of our listeners. CDC is monitoring reports of myocarditis and pericarditis, increased reports of myocarditis and pericarditis in adolescents and young adults after COVID-19 vaccination. The statement has still made the known and potential benefits of COVID outweigh the known and potential risks. What about myocarditis and pericarditis? What are your thoughts on that? And I guess as long as we're talking about complications, any other ones that you hear about a lot?
So what I think is important to know is COVID virus itself with infections can cause myocarditis, inflammation of the heart. And it's actually a very common finding. So yes, there's been some cases associated with the vaccines, but it's a lower risk of getting myocarditis after vaccination than if you were actually infected with the virus. And I believe that's why CDC is saying they still think that this is a favorable risk-benefit ratio. Everything in medicine has risks and benefits. You have to weigh the two. My opinion is, as a healthcare professional and someone who used to do vaccine research, is that the benefits far, far, far outweigh these risks.
I agree 100%. And the other thing about the myocarditis is it seems to be self-limited, that, they have it, they get better quickly. It's not something that gives prolonged problems. Whereas some of the things from prolonged problems that, some do seem to, and hopefully they'll resolve over time. But COVID about, how is that infection going to affect people years down the line, including kids? So anything we can do to prevent, I think, is key. It also prevents spread. It also prevents the potential for more variants. I mean, there's benefits. Now, I'll bring up one sort of elephant in the room about that, which, is especially, it's more coming from some ethics groups and some groups outside the country, which is this idea that it's more important to get those vaccines to adults in other countries than it is to give the vaccines to the kids. Well, again, I understand that point, and the U.S. is doing a ton, in addition to many other countries that are doing a ton to help in other countries. As you know, the U.S. pre-bought millions of doses of AstraZeneca, but AstraZeneca is not approved here in the U.S. So they gave all those doses to be used outside the country under the management of the WHO and this whole big national. So it's not like we're not helping there as well. But in the same time, we're trying to protect our kids. And I think that's
great. Thank you for
I'll also
that.
say that
Dr. Cunningham.
In the last surge we had, a lot of that was driven by school athletic events, travel sports teams, and people mixing together. So by protecting kids, they're less likely to bring it home to mom, dad, grandma, the adults who have medical problems and are at increased risk. And while most kids will have mild symptoms, there have been fatalities from it as well. I don't mean to scare people, but this is not a benign virus that only hits adults.
Yep. I mean, I remember we had a 5-year-old who passed away at Beaumont from COVID, and I know one of their relatives, and it was devastating to the family, of course. but was a young girl and should have never happened.
One of the things that we've heard reported directly from CDC is that over the last year and a half, there have been, for example, 49,000 pediatrics, shall we say, those under, I believe, the age of 17 or 18, who have died of all causes, with approximately 300 from COVID. Does that, I mean, is that part of the argument that you mentioned, the elephant in the room, the ethics folks coming out there with? I mean, 49,000 of all deaths and 300 from COVID, official CDC numbers. Is that where some of this wrestling is happening with?
I think that's part of it, and it's risk is so much lower than the personal risk of an adult in a low-income country that doesn't have a lot. But I'll add one other interesting thing to that mix of, well, it's all well and good to say, just don't give it to the kids, just ship it all these vaccines off to other countries. Well, Nepal just ended their vaccination program temporarily because they ran out of vaccine, but they also didn't have the infrastructure to vaccinate everybody. So let's say we shipped off all these vaccines. Well, how many of them are going to expire unused because these countries development also in order to do this? When smallpox vaccinations were going on, when polio vaccinations were going on and still are going on, the advantage there is you could walk into these countries with vaccines that didn't need to be refrigerated and give them to people. And you went out into whatever area. These vaccines need to be refrigerated. Some of them need to be frozen. You can't just say, okay, we're shipping 1 million off to Nepal and 1 million off to this country and 1 million off to that country. Go ahead, give it to all the adults. It's not that simple. And, if we just shipped it off that way, it would be a huge waste of vaccine.
These things don't just sit there on the shelf for years being okay. We remember in the early days of the vaccines, we were tracking how many had been shipped and how many were put into arms, and it was a very long lag between those. So I think your point is well taken. Another question came in terms of, and we were going to talk about approval at the end. Maybe we'll talk about it now because it relates to kids. I also just want to let our audience know, like we said, we usually have a hard cutoff at 3. Doctors Sims and Cunningham said they can go a little bit beyond that. We're going to take as many topics here as we can. We've still got to touch on boosters before this is all over. So if you got to drop off, we understand, but we're going to try to pack as much in as we can here since we have these two gentlemen and their gracious time. The question here has to do with EUAs versus approvals. And I remember a conversation recently where somebody said, well, why don't they just approve it? And the answer in part is because what they're doing now is a temporary authorization. They could pull the thing in a moment. It's very, very different from the process that a new drug application has to go through, for example, to get approved. But a lot of people are saying, I don't know if I want to give it to my kids because, this is just this temporary thing. In some sense, experimental is not the right word at all. It is not, but it is an emergency use authorization. The conditions under which it's being given are different from what we would give a drug in the U.S. under normal circumstances. So I guess a couple questions there. One is, are any vaccines near approval in the U.S.? And what do you think? Is this going to happen soon?
So
I
Pfizer,
absolutely want to stress
go ahead, Dr.
emergency use authorization is approved. Typically, after 6 months of emergency use, you go to full approval. Pfizer and Moderna already submitted their data asking for that full approval. J&J came out a little later, so I think they can submit their data in August for full approval. The emergency use authorization lets the FDA rapidly react to urgent public health threats. There was nothing cut in terms of the clinical studies. What FDA does is streamline the regulatory or paperwork processes. Everything is still reviewed, analyzed by independent experts, and I had no qualms giving the vaccines to my children.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I had zero qualm giving the vaccines to my children as well, or my wife. I mean, that was one of my, I think it's the strongest thing a doctor can say, is we believe in this so much. Not only did we get it, we gave it to all our loved ones, including our kids. So that's one thing. But Dr. Cunningham's exactly right. Nobody expects this EUA is quote unquote temporary emergency. Nobody expects them to suddenly pull that. We expect full approval. That said, there's a process to that. And Pfizer and Moderna have submitted, and they're being reviewed. And how long they take to review, that's the FDA's ball of wax. I don't know how long it'll take them, but I fully expect to come out at the end of this with full approval. People talk about, these vaccines were rushed. They're not, how do we know they're safe, whatnot? Yeah, that normal vaccines take 10 years to bring out. Well, here's the difference, because I've done vaccine studies also. It sounds like Dr. Cunningham has done vaccine studies too. When you're trying to get a vaccine, so I did a vaccine against staph, I did a vaccine against C. diff. When you're trying to get people to join those studies, most people don't tend to see that immediate need to be involved in that study and be one of those people to get that vaccine approved, right? So we had, over the space of a year or two at our site, we recruited, 20, 30 people to those studies. And they had 1,000 sites maybe or more recruiting people to try to get their numbers, right? Whereas here, every one of these studies had 40,000 people enrolled in the space of a month or two. Why? And they did it in, less than 100 sites. Why? Because we're in the middle of a pandemic and everybody jumped at the chance of being involved in this study. Not only that, the vaccine studies are based on how many cases break through in the vaccine arm versus the placebo arm. Well, it's much easier to figure that out in the middle of a pandemic where lots of people are getting infected than it is in a group where the infection rate is relatively low. As Dr. Cunningham said, the FDA streamlined the process. Operation Warp Speed threw money at it, right, which let these companies just develop things faster and faster. They didn't cut corners. They made things a little smoother in terms of filling out, and the very nature of the pandemic is what made it possible to do these studies as fast as they could.
We certainly saw that on the device side.
And right now, over 184 million people in the United States alone have had at least one dose of vaccine. When you start getting those numbers, you can be really sure that the safety profile is excellent and accurate.
It is a pretty good statistical sample, yeah. And we saw the same thing on the device side in our business. When people were going and FDA was responsive all of a sudden, and things didn't take 6 months. It took like a week. What on earth? Well, yeah, that's a great part of the explanation. Well, in the time we have left, I want to talk about two things. One is masks and one is boosters, and I know the audience is interested in both of those. But mask mandates are lifting everywhere. Although I've heard that in Israel they are actually reinstating. We heard in LA, I think they are too.
Mm-hmm.
Talk to us about masks. What you see, what you think is happening. What's going on? And does either of you have any information about the Israeli demographic?
One thing is really clear: masks work, right? And you want to know why we know masks work? Because this year, while people were masking, there were 0 cases of flu and 0 cases of RSV, right? Things were almost zero. But, there's no such, in medicine, there's no such thing as zero. But I mean, literally, we had entire months where we had 0 positive tests for flu, 0 positive tests for RSV. Mask mandates went away, and you know what we're seeing now? RSV, right? I just looked at our numbers. We're getting 20-something cases a week when we were 0. I mean, and again, it's 20-something cases a week in the summer. It's not RSV season. That's during the winter, right? Masks work. Masks prevent spread of virus, including COVID. If we didn't have mask mandates, the numbers we saw now with COVID, higher it would have been, right? As soon as we instituted universal masking in the hospitals, the cases spreading in the hospitals went down unbelievably. They work. It's that simple. People talk about it as an impingement of their freedoms. It's not about public safety, right? They say, you can't make me wear a mask. Well, we can make you wear a seatbelt. We can make you wear clothing. There's absolutely nothing in the law that says we can't make you wear a mask. And, clothing, that's about modesty and, and whatnot. That's about, what are people seeing? This is about protecting people's lives, there's absolutely nothing that says that, except for new laws that people are trying to draft to say you can't make people wear masks, which are just ridiculous because they're one of our strongest things against preventing a respiratory infection. Okay. So that's number one. Number two, they work. It's just that simple. They work. And people are removing these mask mandates because of pressure from groups that say, we don't want to wear masks anymore. And you get people saying, oh, you get buildup of carbon dioxide. Oh, you get recirculation of bacteria. Oh, you get all these things. Never any of that has been shown. People who say, I can't wear a mask, I can't breathe in the mask. These masks have, they're absolutely porous to oxygen. They're absolutely porous to carbon dioxide. You do not suffocate in these masks, right? That sort of stuff is absolute nonsense. And, again, they have done nothing but help prevent. And every time we take the masks away, we think things go back up.
Dr.
I will
Cunningham,
also
anything to
add that I'm all in favor of the mask, and Michigan Occupational Safety and Health Administration is requiring hospitals, healthcare facilities to continue requiring masks for visitors, patients, and staff. So if you come to any of the hospitals, don't be surprised by that.
Yeah.
Yep, makes sense. Well, let's go on to the question of boosters. And this, I know we're sort of speculating here because I'm pretty sure that we don't know how long anything lasts on average. It's been too short. Maybe there's new information though. What of boosters? What of durability, longevity of vaccines, natural immunity, et cetera?
Well, so okay, that it varies from vaccine to vaccine, right? Chickenpox, you get your vaccine and you never get it. You never need a boost, really. Though we do boost for shingles, same thing, right? Chickenpox, shingles, same expressions of the infection, and you need much higher antibody level to prevent shingles. Some vaccines you just don't need boosters. Other vaccines you need boosters every 5 to 10 years. Other vaccines you need something every year, right? So we don't know yet where this is going to go. The reason that this is a big question is, there are 6 other human coronaviruses, right? MERS and SARS are the 2 deadly ones. And then there are 4 that are basically forms of the common cold. Well, we know that people who get those common cold forms, the antibodies go away after about a year. So nobody was really sure what was going to happen with COVID. Again, there's this thing called natural boosting where you get exposed to it in the environment and that bumps up your antibody level. So it may not go away so simply as long as there's any COVID circulating around. And nobody's expecting it to go away at this point. Even with vaccination, even with everything we're doing, nobody's expecting that COVID is going to just disappear, right? It's going to be more like the flu now. So that's what sort of brought the whole booster question up originally. Well, now it's being driven by, statements from Pfizer that, we think that booster will help. We think that there may be waning immunity, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the studies I've seen published have not shown significant waning immunity yet, right? And that's the key. As Dr. Cunningham mentioned, all the tests are a little different, et cetera, et cetera. There's a T cell component, which isn't measured. There's a memory B cell component, which isn't measured. All they're measuring is raw antibody level. And even there, it drops, but does it drop to below the point that it's protective? Not yet. Right now, what has Pfizer said? Well, Pfizer's got 2 things they've been pushing with this booster phenomenon. One is just give a 3rd dose of the vaccine we already have, right? The idea was they researched and shown that people who get a 3rd dose get about a 10-fold bump in their antibody levels, right? And the other studies, like the ones I showed, show that the decrease in neutralization for Delta is, about 10-fold, maybe 5 to 10-fold. Well, to bump your antibodies up 10-fold, you fix that there. Now, the problem is they haven't shown that really helps, right? Is that bump neutralizing antibody or is that bump just antibody? That's what they haven't shown. And they need to. So that's one issue. The second issue is the second thing they're doing is they're making a Delta specific booster, right? And I wouldn't even call it a booster. They're making a Delta-specific vaccine, right? And I think that's a great idea. That when you have a version of the virus that doesn't respond, cause as good that you don't get as good a neutralization, that targets that virus, so you get as good a neutralization. I've been saying forever, this is the natural evolution of vaccines. We go from mono or duovalent or something like that to polyvalent, right? The pneumonia, right? We started with Prevnar 7. For a short time, we had 10. Now it's 13. And now they're working on Prevnar 20, right? The HPV vaccine started with 4, the 4 most dangerous strains that give you cervical cancer. And now they've added strains that cause, less likely to cause cancer, but can and whatnot. Working on a 12 or a 16 or something like that. This is the natural history of vaccines, that they go from low valency to higher valency. That's what we're going to see with COVID. I expect that in 5 years, the COVID vaccine might have wild type Delta, Lambda, and, who knows what the next variant it's going to need in it is.
Would it be correct to say that this is similar to what we do with the flu every year, where we're
It's a little different there.
The
flu changes very rapidly sometimes. So what they do is they pick flu strains that are circulating in the other hemisphere before. So they pick strains that are circulated. For us, they pick strains from the southern hemisphere that they think are going to come here, and but they guess wrong a lot. That's why flu is only so protective. But there's a lot of cross protection, which is why it protects against serious disease. So it's similar, but not quite the same. It's more like what the flu has, right? The flu is a trivalent vaccine, 3 different viruses in it, or a quadrivalent vaccine, 4 different viruses in it. It's more like that.
Gotcha. Quick comment from Dr. Cunningham on this, and then we've got a really interesting question from one of our listeners. You're on mute,
You're
sir.
muted, Dr. Cunningham.
I don't think we're ready for boosters yet. I do think we're going to need to have that combo to get some of the different variants, but time will tell us.
Great. Those are good comments. We had this really interesting question from one of our listeners. He says, having seen many therapies receive full approval over the last few decades and then be removed from the market due to degradation of the, quote, safety profile over time, and with stricter monitoring, usually at VA or through a massive men's and women's health studies, are you concerned at all about endorsing under 12 peds to take a medication which for now in 2021 is a generally treatable condition, especially with little legal recourse down the road? Like what he's saying is if we...
Well, I think it...
Yeah,
I think it's a misconception. It's a misconception that COVID's easily treated. We have medicines, they are not great. I don't like my chances if I'm in the intensive care unit on a ventilator. Typically with vaccines, within 8 weeks, you're going to see what are quote unquote long-term reactions. So with 184 million doses in the US, I'm pretty comfortable with it. I'm not saying helps me feel good. And I'm sorry, I'm in the middle of a thunderstorm, so.
No, it's fine. We did lose you there. Wait just 5 seconds and then try again on the last 20 seconds, and we'll take that answer.
So I was just going to say, typically long-term problems with vaccines occur within 8 weeks of getting the vaccine. I'm not saying to vaccinate under 12. We need to see what those clinical trials show. If the trials are favorable, I'll say go for it.
Yeah, I agree 100%. One thing about a lot of these drugs that have been removed for quote unquote less favorable safety profiles, when you look at the numbers, they're for the most part, the FDA has gotten a little overcautious in some of those things. If you look at aspirin could never get FDA approval nowadays. The side effects are way too high, right? Just on GI bleeds alone, right? But it's a generally considered safe over-the-counter drug. Same thing for Advil, same thing for naproxen. Same thing for so many of our over-the-counter drugs, right? The FDA has gotten overly cautious because of litigation, because some of these companies are getting hit with these ridiculous things. I mean, you can look back at things like removal of Vioxx. I don't know a single physician who thinks that the removal of Vioxx was a good idea, right? Because it was literally like this teeny tiny little chance of increased heart problems that nobody could really prove was true, right? And some of the, they're the only drugs we have to do that. They once removed a drug called Propulsid, right? Which, because it was causing potential heart arrhythmias, which it was. But it was also the only drug we had to treat the hypomotility syndrome that was used to treat. So what did they do? They brought it back, and you have to sign waivers and whatnot, right? As Dr. Cunningham said, everything in medicine has risks and benefits, everything, right? And most of there are definitely cases where something got approved and they found out there's a serious something when they treated 1 million people. But again, we've already treated 184 million people just in the US, and we haven't seen any serious problems. In addition to that, some of those removals, they found out later, the companies were hiding things. So I can think of at least 2 or 3 drugs that got approved, including one that's still on the market that the FDA has put 3 black box warnings on and has not removed it, where the company literally hid something, or there was fraud involved in the clinical trial, and no clinical trials have been watched closer than these. So I'm not worried about fraud or a company hiding things because these trials have been watched like a hawk. But that being said, so those things, there were obvious reasons to remove. But, this concept that, well, look, some drugs get removed because eventually we find something wrong. As I said, most of the time, physicians don't always agree with that removal, frequently don't agree with that removal. And, it's just, if you took that attitude, we wouldn't have any new medications, period.
One of the things longtime viewers of the show will hear from us is benefit risk, usually on the device side of the world, but it's a staple and has to be well understood to be able to treat anything, to compare the benefit of using the thing to the risk of its use. Dr. Cunningham, any last thoughts on that topic? If we still have you due to the storm.
Nope, I agree that I'm not very concerned about this coming off the market. I've just seen too many people sick, and even kids who come in the hospital, one of these unfortunate ones who get this multi-system inflammatory condition afterwards, 12% of them wind up on heart-lung bypass. So this is not a routine virus that is going to be easily treated. There's some kids who get very sick, some who have died from it. It applies to adults too. We have medicine, but when you look at the evidence we have for the different drugs like remdesivir and Toci for treating COVID, it's pretty weak evidence. It's just the best we have right now. It would never be used in this situation if we weren't in a pandemic. It's the best we can do right now, but I hope we get some better treatment options down the road.
Amen.
Well, we're going to go to our audience one more time. If there's any other questions that you have or comments for our very gracious guests who have spent an hour and 20 minutes of our time. I also want to welcome Stacy Frankovich back to the floor with us, just to thank our panelists today, Dr. Cunningham and Dr. Sims. There's Stacy.
Hello. I cannot thank you two enough for just blessing us with the time and the information. I was taking mad notes. I feel very well armed to have conversations with those that are struggling with the choice to vaccinate without being condescending or rude or belittling people, but to just be armed with information. So just so very thankful that you have shared your time and your talent with us today, and thankful to Jean for always bringing such interesting content to the show. I don't think we lost any viewers, which is great. So we stayed on over, and I don't think we lost any viewers. So just very grateful. Thank you so much for your time and the work that you're doing and continue to do.
Yeah, happy to be here. Happy
My
to
pleasure.
Added.
Dr. Cunningham, Dr. Sims, thank you so much. Thank you to all our viewers, everyone that stayed on. Next week, we have one more session in partnership with MedHealth. We're going to be talking about our friends in Canada and the wonderful relationship that we have, especially between Michigan and Windsor. And that border is still not fully open. What should that look like? Where's that going to go? We're going to be talking about that. Both with medical and with business leaders. So join us for that. After that, in the month of August, we're going to turn our attention on MedTech Crossroads to the world of medtech manufacturing. We're going to be talking with many of our local and regional manufacturers and introduce you to many of those. So look forward to that, and we'll see you here next week for one more show in partnership with MedHealth. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.